All right, so let's think about this idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. If you consider it, it's a fairly strong claim that somehow, if you don't engage in self-examination, your life, you might as well not have been born. It's kind of a strange thing to say. So consider an example that I touched on in our last lecture, namely, suppose there's a young woman, recent college graduate named Mary. Mary has decided to devote herself to trying to protect these women from being lured into essentially prostitution and a kind of slavery by these men who come to their villages. So she spends all day going from door to door, from one house to another, knocking on the doors, trying to talk to the young women, going to the cafes, going to the supermarkets, going to the restaurants and to the clubs, and talking to young women and saying, look, these guys in the fancy clothes and the flash cars who are suggesting that you come with them to these great jobs in Paris and London and other places, don't believe them. They're going to try to make you into prostitutes and you'll never come back. So Mary takes herself to be trying to essentially save the lives of these young women who are, granted they're in poverty, but if they were to go with these men, they would be worse off than they are now. But she works really hard. She's exhausted. She does something that she really cares about, but at the end of the day, she doesn't have time to read philosophy or psychology or literature. She's just tired. So she goes back to her little apartment in one of the cities in Moldova, perhaps, and just collapses in order to restore herself to get back to work the next day. Now, on a strict interpretation of the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, well, Mary doesn't spend a whole lot of time in examination of herself or others. She doesn't engage in what, in any traditional sense of the term, we could call philosophy. She's doing practical things. She's trying to save other young women from harm. And if Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living is to be taken literally, we'd have to infer from that Mary's life is not worth living, which seems absurd. That is to say, it seems absurd to say that Mary might as well not have been born because she doesn't engage in self-examination. That just doesn't seem very plausible, at least to me and to the many people that I've asked. After all, Mary's doing something that most of us would consider to be very valuable, that is, saving many young women in Moldova from harm that they could perhaps never pull themselves out of. So we need to think about another interpretation we might give to the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. And what I want to suggest is a useful reinterpretation of the idea by Professor Richard Kraut of Northwestern University in an article entitled The Examined Life, in which he suggests that if we look at the actual Greek, we'll see the word biotos, and biotos can be interpreted not as not worth living, but rather not to be lived. So the idea is that in that phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living, that can be understood as the unexamined life is not to be lived. And that itself in turn means that something more like this: one should engage in self-examination, but at least open the question whether or not if someone who doesn't engage in self-examination thereby lives a useless life. So this idea that the unexamined life is not to be lived is more open-ended. It's just a suggestion that examination of a philosophical kind is a good thing, but not absolutely necessary in order to live a life that anybody would call worthwhile. So Kraut's idea is self-examination is a good thing, it's worthwhile, but if someone like Mary engages in what she does, but doesn't engage in self-examination, then it would seem that her life might still be worthwhile, depending upon why she's doing what she is. Let's back up a little bit. If we were to take into account the reasons why Mary is doing what she did, what she's doing with her life, presumably the answer would not be that she's doing it in order to get rich, that she's doing it in order to get famous, that she's doing it in order to make friends in a particular part of the world. Rather, presumably the reason why she's doing what she is that she wants to help out her fellow human beings and prevent them from falling into great suffering. And that, I'm just guessing now, was probably because she cares about her fellow human beings and maybe is even willing to sacrifice her own well-being in order to better the lot of people less fortunate than she is. Now, that point of view is probably something that she got to after a certain amount of self-examination, after a certain amount of thinking about what is valuable to her life, what is valuable to to making her be a person that she can continue to respect, that is, continue to respect herself after what she has done. She, unlike her other college graduate friends, did not decide to go off and make as much money as she could or to acquire as much fame as she could, but rather she decided to help out her fellow human beings as best she could. And that decision probably is one that was based on a certain amount of self-examination, a certain amount of reflection of what was important to her. Now, if that's right, then she would count as living an examined life in that broader sense, even if she's not engaging in self-examination right now. So she has engaged probably in some self-examination, but the fact that in the, say, 2 or 3 years that she spends in Moldova trying to prevent other women from being lured into prostitution and a kind of slavery, even if she's not engaging in self-examination during that time because she's so busy, she doesn't have enough time to do it then, her behavior probably is the result of a certain amount of self-examination. And so her life is one that gains in value because of that, even if she doesn't engage in self-examination now. First point. Second point is that the interpretation that Richard Kraut has of the idea of the unexamined life suggests that a person can still live a worthwhile life even if they never engage in any self-examination. Rather, their life is still worthwhile, but they might still be missing something. So what might they be missing if they never engage in self-examination? Well, in his article on this topic, Kraut gives a few examples of characters from the corpus of Plato's writings that seem to be pretty good examples of people who could do with a little more self-examination, a little more self-knowledge, and if they were to engage in it, would probably live lives that were more worthwhile. So here are the examples that he gives. Number one, there's a character in one of the famous Platonic dialogues named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is a citizen of Athens, like Socrates is. And one day Socrates runs into Euthyphro and says, "Hey, Euthyphro, what's up?" And Euthyphro says, "Oh, just going to court." And Socrates says, "Oh, yeah, what are you going to do at court?" Euthyphro says, "I'm going to prosecute my dad." Socrates says, "Really? That's amazing. What are you going to prosecute your father for?" And Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm going to prosecute my father for having killed one of our slaves." Back then, Athenians held slaves. And Socrates says, "Wow, you're going to prosecute your father for having killed one of your slaves, and you're presumably going to prosecute him for murder." And Euthyphro says, "Yes, is exactly right." And Socrates says, "Boy, you must really know the difference between what is right and wrong. You must really have your eye on the prize with regard to the nature of morality, huh?" And Euthyphro says, "You bet I do." And Socrates is amazed, impressed, and then goes on to show that in fact Euthyphro does not understand the source, nature, and substance of morality, and thereby kind of makes a fool out of Euthyphro in the course of a couple of pages of dialogue. So Euthyphro believes himself to have wisdom about the nature of right and wrong, but Socrates shows without too much difficulty that he doesn't, that profession is hollow, that his putative knowledge about the nature of morality is specious. So that's an example of someone that I think Kraut, as an interpreter of Socrates, would probably say Euthyphro is someone who could do with a little more self-examination. His life is worthwhile, but it would be of more value to himself and presumably to others if he were to think a little bit more reflectively about the nature and source of his beliefs about right and wrong. So that's the example of Euthyphro. Another example is Crito, one of Socrates' young friends who tends to follow him around from one conversation to another. Crito enters into the Platonic writings later on, after Socrates has been accused, he's been sentenced, he's now in jail, and he is soon to be forced to drink the hemlock that will cause his demise. Crito comes to him one morning in his jail cell and says, "Look, Socrates, I could easily help you escape. We could bribe the jailers, we could get you out of here under disguise, come with us and we'll get you to another city-state where you'll be able to live out the rest of your years and no one will mind." And Crito says, and furthermore, I really would like you to do this because people know that I could help, my friends, that I could help you escape. And if it turns out that we don't help you escape, people will be accusing us of not having done so, and we'll be embarrassed. So please don't make a fool out of me for having not been able to save you from your death sentence by not allowing me to help you escape. Socrates replies, "Actually, Crito, I'm not impressed with that reasoning. The idea is that you want me to go back on my principles about the unexamined life because out of fear of your being embarrassed in the eyes of fellow Athenians. I think you're making a mistake in taking your status, prestige, what the ancient Greeks called the spirited part of the soul, I think you're making a mistake in taking status and prestige to be more important than doing what is right. So I'm not going to even be bothered by this temptation to escape. I'll sit here and accept my fate, drink the hemlock, and meet my end if that's what it takes, rather than succumb to your temptation to not let you get embarrassed. So Socrates would probably say that Crito could use with a little bit of self-examination as well, because Crito would probably do well to reflect on why he's so worried about his standing in the opinions of others. And as a more general point, we will be looking in this course at general questions about why we care, to what extent we care, whether we should care about what other people think of us. Socrates, for one, is completely indifferent to the question of what other people think of him. Many of us, probably most of us, aren't capable of being totally indifferent to that question, but we might think about the extent to which we should be indifferent, or whether we should care. The idea of the esteem of others, prestige, status, is something that we'll be taking on later on in this course, thinking about how important it is and whether it should be as important as it is. So that's example 2, Crito. So Ion is the third character that Socrates would probably have something to say about, and that Richard Krapp mentions in his article. Ion is a rhapsode, and that means his job is to go around Athens and telling people, reciting for people lines from Homeric poetry, so for example from the Odyssey. So Ion's job is to let his mind be filled with the lines of Homer and then recite them for any audience that was willing to listen. And remember, at this time, in the absence of iPads and Kindles and various other technologies that we have and take for granted now, one of your only ways of being entertained by a storyteller was in person. You couldn't get it in any other way. And so if there was a rhapsode in town, people wanted to come to listen. It was very exciting to hear one of these great stories. So that was all fine. But Ion was willing to let his mind be totally full of the thoughts of someone else, that is, the thoughts of Homer. So he was not thinking for himself, Socrates would probably say. He was thinking somebody else's thoughts, and insofar as that is the case, he was not being able to cultivate his own intellect, not being able to develop his own rational faculties. He was just kind of a vessel through which other people's thoughts would flow. So that be another example of a kind of failure of self-examination from Socrates' point of view, because Ion can fill his days with espousing, expressing, spewing out the thoughts of others without ever having to develop thoughts of his own. Developing thoughts of your own, developing ideas of your own, is hard work. It's painstaking. It takes lots of patience. It takes a lot of sweat sometimes. Ion never apparently had to do that, and so to that extent did not engage in as much self-examination as he might have. So again, on Professor Kraut's interpretation of the unexamined life is not worth living idea, Ion's life is still worth living. It's just that he's missing something, just as Crito is missing something by virtue of being too hung up on how he's seen by others, and just as Euthyphro is missing something by being insufficiently reflective about the nature of his knowledge of morality. So those are 3 examples of characters from the Platonic corpus who are living insufficiently examined lives, and by that much are missing something. This idea of not thinking your own thoughts has a modern expression in Oscar Wilde, who in De Profundis says, most people are other people. And it's kind of an amazing thought if you think about it, the idea that most people are other people. What would it mean to be another person? Well, I think that what Wilde has in mind is something like the following, that so many of our characteristics, so many of our thoughts, so many of our ideas, even perhaps so many of our emotions are ones that are borrowed from others. That is, we take a point of view, we take an attitude, we take a doctrine, we take a slogan, and we incorporate it from somebody else's thinking into our own, and thereby make a kind of mashup, a pastiche for ourselves of other people's thoughts and call them our own. And I think Wilde's idea is that in so doing, we're not fulfilling a responsibility to ourselves to think thoughts that are truly our own, to try to view the world in our own distinctive and individual ways. Insofar as we borrow other people's thoughts, we end up going along for the ride, going on the coattails of someone else, not coming up with our own distinctive point of view. Now, if someone were to criticize criticize Wilde's view, they might say, well, wait a minute, it's not as if I can come up with ideas radically different, totally new, 100% original. After all, most of the material that anybody has probably starts out with something that they got from someone else, to which someone like Socrates might reply, that may be true, but there's a difference between taking something fully formed from someone else and just using it without any modification, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, taking some basic material from other people, thoughts, ideas, emotions, points of view, and then trying to change them, modify them, cultivate them in some way that allows them to become distinctively your own. So I don't think that Wilde would say, insofar as you borrow somebody else's thoughts, you're failing to engage in self-understanding, self-analysis, and self-cultivation, but in so doing, that's just the first step, and you need to go on to further steps in order to make these ideas something distinctively yours, as opposed to something that's really ultimately just borrowed.